Well, hey, my name's Colin. If we haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I get the privilege of serving here as a lead pastor of Nona Church, and we are in part 2 of our series, Table Talk, where we're really looking at what it looks like for us as people to know and take our next best step in following Jesus in 2020. And last week, we talked about this reality that whenever we go on a journey, if we don't know where we are, you can't know where you're going. If you don't know where you are, you can't know where you're going. And so with that in mind, we have been really using an illustration or a metaphor that's going to serve us for the next couple of weeks to help us identify where we are in our spiritual journey so that by the end of 2020, we're not where we used to be, that we're more in love with Jesus, more connected in relationship, have more of our questions answered. And so by way of kind of review, last week we talked about 4 chairs that really serve as 4 metaphors for our stages in our spiritual life. The first chair was the chair of curiosity, the curious chair. And this chair you can push away from the table. The table is representative of the local church. The food is representative of the good news of Jesus. But when you're in the curious chair, you're not sure what you believe about faith. You're not sure if you're buying this whole following Jesus thing. And so maybe you find yourself coming back to church because everything else you've tried just hasn't worked out. And you're saying, I'm not sure about this thing. And we would encourage you, if that's the season that you're in, man, you could have not picked a better place to call home. We've designed this place to help you explore and discover faith. We say this a lot. You can belong at Nona far before you ever believe. You can go as fast as you want and as slow as you need in your journey with Jesus. And our encouragement to you, if you find yourself in this seat and in this chair, is to simply stay a while. The longer you're here, the more likely you are to get those questions that are so hard to answer answered. The second chair is the child's chair. And the child's chair is the chair that all of us, if we become followers of Jesus, find ourselves in at some point. The child's chair is that season of our life in our ministry where we're saying this, man, I need help. Quick raise of hands. How many of y'all have ever been in a place where you needed some help? Anybody there, right? Yeah. I need help with my marriage. I need help with my finances. I need help understanding this Bible because when I open it up, it doesn't make any sense at all. And if you find yourself in that chair, our encouragement to you this year is to simply take a risk. We don't grow and we don't mature if we simply do the same things over and over again. Maybe this is a year of a first for you. The first time you go on a short-term trip, the first time you serve, the first time you jump into a community group. The child's chair is a great season of life in our spiritual journey, but we don't want to stay there too long. It's cute when a kid is in a high chair. It's weird when an adult sits in a high chair, right? And we want to move forward in our faith. When we get from this season of our life and our stage of kind of walking with Jesus, we can go one of 2 directions. And for the most of us, we end up in a season where we find ourselves in the comfy chair, right? Anybody got one of these at home? The comfy chair is awesome for a season of time. The comfy chair is when we feel like we've got enough answers to our questions. We found a good church that we like. Our kids are enjoying the kids ministry. Maybe we found some good friends. And we just kind of settle into this place where we say, this works fine. Don't ask me to give too much. Don't ask me to serve too much. Don't ask me to change anything in my life. I've got my fire insurance. I know I'm going to heaven because I've trusted Jesus. And that's where things stop. But like we talked about last week, when you sit too long in the comfy chair, your faith begins to erode. And the comfy chair, while comfortable, is the chair that is the furthest away from the table. It's the one that's less connected to the work that God is doing, not only what he wants to do in your life, but in the lives of the people around you. And so the encouragement to those of us that find ourselves in the comfy chair, maybe we've been in this chair because the last church or last religious experience we had was filled with so much hurt. We're kind of a little bit skeptical or worried about jumping back in, and maybe you've been here for a while and it's time to jump back in. Or maybe you're like, hey, I've just been coasting on this spiritual thing and it's been working out for me for a season of life. Here's what we know. As hard as we work to make life comfortable, at some point discomfort is going to happen. And if we don't have good relationships around the table, we will find ourselves alone. And so the challenge, if you find yourself in a space of comfy Christianity this year, is jump in, get involved, try something new. And lastly, we talked about the committed chair. The committed chair are the people that get it. The problem with the committed chair, though, is sometimes you end up finding yourself setting the table and serving everyone else. You forget to sit and enjoy the goodness of what God is doing in your life. And 2020, for many of us, needs to be a season of sitting and enjoying what God has done. We also encourage those that are in the committed chair to ask one question, because I don't know about you, but setting the table can get a little bit tedious sometimes. Picking up the dishes for others can get a little bit tiring. So how is it that we remain inspired to continue to serve in the way that we do? And the question we asked last week is the question I will continue to pose to you this week, to ask this question: who's your one? If you find yourself in the committed chair, who's the one person you're doing this for? Maybe it's a person that you're working with and you're going to pray for them to find a way back to Jesus. Maybe you serve in kids ministry, not so much for you, but because you wish that your kids could have had a great environment to connect with Jesus when they were growing up, and you want to create that environment for someone else. Whatever the reason is, if you find yourself in the committed chair, 2020 is about sitting and enjoying the goodness of God and also serving with one in mind. And I'll continue to challenge you. Who's that name? Who's that person? Let's live our lives for them. And all of this is inspired from some words that Paul wrote to the church in Ephesus. Ephesus was a lot like us, a modern city for that time and era, and he was talking to a young church that was getting started just kind of like we are. And this is what Paul says after talking about leadership. He encouraged the church, and he says this, that the responsibility of those who are leaders in the church is to equip God's people to do his work and build up the church, the body of Christ. This will continue until we all come to such, we'll say this word together on the count of three, 1, 2, 3, unity in our faith and knowledge of God's Son, and that we will be, 1, 2, 3, mature in the Lord, measuring up to the full and complete standard of Christ. Then we'll no longer be immature like kids. We won't be tossed and blown about by every wind of new teaching. We will not be influenced when people try to trick us with lies so clever they sound like the truth. And that's really our heart as a leadership team here, and our heart for every single person here at Nona, is that we would all grow to a place in our walk with God where we are able to discern what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what sounds kind of true, and to be able to give everything that God has placed in us to others for the sake of his glory and the good of the people that are in our community and in our families. And here's what I need you to see as we read Ephesians chapter 4, is that maturity is not measured by how much Bible you know. Maturity isn't measured by how much money you give. Maturity isn't measured by how many Bible studies you've been to over the course of your life. Maturity is measured by one thing. Maturity is measured by how much your life looks like Jesus. How many of us would agree we need a little bit more of our life looking like Jesus than it does right now, right? Of course, that's a forever journey that we're on. But could you imagine if 51 weeks from now, your life looked better than it does now? Your life looked more like Jesus. Isn't that the kind of hope we have for all of the other people in our relationships? Like wives, how many of us would be a lot happier if a year from now our husband looked a little bit more like Jesus, right? We would take that, right? How many of us would hope, right, that our boss would treat us the way that Jesus would treat us if he were our boss? How many of us just would have hoped that we would have parents that would talk to us the way that Jesus would talk to us if we had him as a parent? Of course, that's what we want for everyone else. Well, shouldn't we want it for ourselves and the people that we are related to and connected to? In my personal time, I'm reading through the book of Galatians. It's another letter that Paul writes to a church in a city called Galatia. And he says this in chapter 2, verse 20. This is the heart that I have for my life and really the hope I have for your life as well, that we would be able to say what Paul says about his walk with God. He says this: "My old self has been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. So I live in this earthly body by trusting in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." Hey, I've got some good news today. If you've put your trust and your faith in Jesus, the old you is dead and gone, and the only one that's living and breathing is the new you that has found full hope and destiny in Christ. How many of us are thankful for that truth today? That's what Galatians 2 tells us. So imagine a life where your life looked more like Jesus. That's our hope for you in 2020. So last week we talked about this, right? We said, in order to know where you're going, you've got to know where you are. And that's why the question was, what chair are you sitting in? But today I want to talk to you about something that you know is essential if you've ever been on a long journey. Has anyone ever been on a journey before where you got really hungry? Anybody been there before? In my home, we call that being hangry. It's a combination of hungry and angry, right? When we go on a trip, we get a ton of snacks. Tonight, I'm flying out to London, and I'm going on a budget airliner, and I found out that they do not provide you food, right? And I'm like living out my greatest fear, that I'm going to be caught thousands of miles up in the air with no food. I'm really, really stressed about it, right? What is essential for any good journey? You need some good what? You need some good food, right? You've got to have some really good food because food is absolutely essential. Food is what we need in our lives if we're going to be able to sustain over a long period of time. I was researching ultra marathon runners. Anybody run a marathon? Anybody done that before? If you have, find a different hobby, all right? You need something different. But I was researching ultramarathoners, and here's what I found so interesting about the recommended diet if you are going to run a long race. The night before, you're supposed to eat a lot of carbs. 4 hours before the race, you're supposed to eat a lot of what? Carbs. 2 hours before the race, eat a little bit of carbs. During the race, when you're stopping to grab some gel packs and some other things, you should still have what? You should have carbs in your body, right? Here's the thing. I think the most biblical diet you can have is one filled with carbs. That's what I'm trying to say, all right? Gluten is not of the Lord, all right? It is carbs that we all need. Jesus, while this is true for us physically, Jesus says it spiritually. He says this, you cannot live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from God. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. What is essential to us to be able to be sustained in our personal journeys with God is we've got to be able to lean into the food that God provides for us on his table. But not only is food essential, food is also enjoyable, right? Food is enjoyable. There are some people here who simply, they eat to live, right? You just kind of go about your day, you forget about food, and then you just kind of eat to kind of sustain, right? But then there's a whole other group of people. I like to call them my people, all right? My friends, and they are people who live to eat. We got any of those live to eat people in here? Like the reason why God has made me, Ephesians 2, I've been created with a purpose, and that purpose is to enjoy really good food, right? I love to eat. I love that food isn't just something that we can have to kind of sustain us, but God's created food to be enjoyable for us to eat as well. The only reason why I exercise is so that I can pull up to any restaurant and order whatever I want without shame. Like that's the only reason why I do it. And I think it's interesting that David and the psalmists who write about kind of what it's like to be in a relationship with God could use any metaphor, and yet this is the one that they use. They use food. Psalm 34, verse 8 says this, taste and see that the Lord is good. Revelation 19, 6 and 7, John, Jesus' best friend, has a vision of what heaven is going to be like one day. If you put your faith and your trust in Jesus, and this is what he says. He says, praise the Lord, for the Lord our God, the Lord Almighty, reigns. Let us be glad and rejoice, and let us give honor to him. This is the end of the story. This is when we're all with God. He says, for the time has come. And he could say anything he wants to here. And this is what he says, for the wedding feast of the Lamb. Isn't it interesting that every time there's a celebration, food is involved? My son Jackson turned 4 this week, and so we went to Disney, and he had churros and chocolate at Disney. Highly recommend. And then we went to Chick-fil-A to celebrate the fact that he's 4, right? I love birthdays. We just celebrate the fact that you arrived, right? You did none of the work. Mom doesn't get any celebration, but here we go, right? And on Chick-fil-A, we had Chick-fil-A with ice cream. I gave him a whole bowl of ice cream by himself. At night, we had pizza from our favorite little Italian joint. And then we had more cake and ice cream, right? Because that's what you do to celebrate. Isn't it interesting that God's picture of celebration, the kind of apex of what happens when he is reunited with us, is that we will be around a table celebrating around a good meal. Today, I want to ask this question. What's the food on God's table? I want to give you the answer. It's what we call the gospel. Write that down. Write that phrase down, the gospel. Now, I know that if you grew up in church, you've heard this phrase gospel a million times. And sometimes that word gospel can almost feel kind of overused, if we're honest. Sometimes that word can feel a little bit kind of like we just attach it to everything. What is the gospel? What does that word mean? That's what I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about today. The word gospel simply means good news. So what is this good news that you and we need to feast on every single day of our life? I think the best definition comes from a book about marriage written by Dr. Timothy Keller. It's a book called The Meaning of Marriage, and this is what he says. He says, the gospel is this, that we are more sinful and flawed in ourselves than we ever dared believe. Look at somebody and say, you're worse than you think you are. Go ahead and say that. You're worse than you think you are, okay? Yet, just pick one. Yet, look at this. At the same time, we are more loved and accepted in Jesus than we ever dared hope. Man, that's just not good news. That's the best news. I like to think that the gospel is what God has done for you, what God has done in you, and what God has done through you. Let me explain this. What has God done for you? Why is this good news? God has done this for us. He has made us completely loved. John 3:16 tells us that we are completely loved because of what God has done for us. What has God done in us? 2 Corinthians 5:17 tells us that we are a new creation, that the old me is gone, the new me has come, that God sees me as how I was intended to be. God doesn't see me for my mistakes. God doesn't see me for my regrets. God doesn't see me for all of the dumb things that I've done in my past or will do in my future. God sees me how he intended me to be, and through you. It's good news for all of us. Ephesians 2 tells us that God saved us for a purpose. That when I feel directionless, when I feel like I'm just in the grind, doing the same thing over and over and over again, I think it's amazing to think, and this is good news for you to know, that when God had you in mind, he dreamt up a specific purpose and plan for you, and you have been custom designed to look the way that you do, to have the mind that you do, to live where you live, to have the background and story that you have. No ounce of your story has ever been wasted. It is all being used by God to accomplish exactly what he dreamt up for you in the first place. Is that not good news? Can we thank God for that? I think it is incredible what God has done for us. And that's food that we need to sit at and enjoy. Man, I talked to you about being at the committed seat. If you're committed, sometimes you just got to allow that to be the fuel for your soul. That God is for you. That God is working in you. And God is going to do something incredible and will continue to do great things through you. We just have to bask in that truth. But just like we eat a meal and a couple hours later, or if you're like me, a couple minutes later, you want another meal, we need to be reminded of this truth because it's too easy to forget that, isn't it? It's too easy for us to forget what God has done for us. The food for our soul that we need, the gospel, it's essential and it's meant to be enjoyed. It's the good news of Jesus, and we need it all the time. Which begs two questions I want to ask today for the remainder of our time. What would you do if you lived in a place where there was no food, there was no good news, and there was no table, there was no local church for you to even come and gather around if you were looking for hope? Well, unfortunately, in the world that we live, that is the reality for far too many people. In fact, of the 17,000 people groups that exist on our planet, 7,000 of those people groups do not have access to the gospel right now in 2019. The top 50 of those people groups, 1.48 billion of those people have not heard of the good news of Jesus. One report says that if you were to look at the kind of entire world and look at each person in the population, about a quarter of the world have yet to hear the good news of Jesus in a way that they could respond to it and be able to be transformed by it. And what's even more sad for me is that when we look at churches in North America and in the West, and we think about the money that we give and the places that we invest, for every dollar that is spent in ministry, less than 1 penny goes to the work to reach those that have no food and have no table. That's why our church is so committed to giving 10% away of every dollar that's given here to both local and global work. 8.5% of every dollar that we invest goes directly into global work. And we're focused on areas and in places that don't have tables and don't have food. Here's the second question I would ask, is what would you do if you knew people had no food? Hey, Josh, can you pass me that black box right there? When I was in college, I was an idealist. In fact, when I was in college, I kind of moved from the curious chair over to the child's chair. And here's what's dangerous about the child's chair, okay? In the child's chair, when you hear things like take a risk, you know what you actually do every now and then? You take a risk. And so there's a season of my life, and I continue to try and recapture that season, where I read the Bible and I just believed it, and that what it said is what it meant to do, right? And so I'd come across these verses, right, where Jesus would say things like, if you don't feed the hungry, you're actually choosing not to feed me. And I just got beat up by this. And so I remember one semester, I had a food plan at the University of Florida where you could kind of preset how many meals you could eat over the course of a year. Well, I was really social, and I found that there's a lot of free food options. And so I didn't go to the cafeteria as often as I thought I was going to. And in the last week of school, I realized that I had about 40 meals left that I could eat. And so on the last day or so, before the semester was wrapped out, I walked into the cafeteria and I grabbed 40 to-go boxes and I started filling them up with food. And the reason why is Alachua County, where Gainesville is, there's a lot of homeless people that kind of live in that area. And there's a group of homeless folks around the corner that we wanted to share the good news of Jesus with. And so in my mind, this is the way I thought, okay? And I know I was just, a dumb teenager, right? In my mind, the way I thought was, I've got 40 meals that have been pre-purchased, right? I'm not going to be able to eat 40 meals. And there are people that need food out there. And there's food in here, and they need food out there. So I'm just going to pack up these boxes of food, and I'm going to take them out, right? So if you can imagine, I go to the sandwich line, right? And I walk up, and I'm like, hey, I need 40 ham and cheese sandwiches. And then I go over to the salad bar, and I grab some stuff. I'm getting cupcakes. I'm like going over to the bakery area, and I'm like, hey, could you just give me 80 cookies, And so all of a sudden people are beginning to whisper and they're trying to figure out what's going on with this guy. And then a manager comes out to me and says, hey, you're not allowed to take 40 boxes of food out of the cafeteria. To which I said, I'm pretty sure I paid for 40 boxes of food. And I can eat them when I want to eat them. And I can take when I want to take them. We had a standoff for an hour and a half. Eventually, they said, well, here's the deal. You can only take the number of boxes that you can carry out on your own. And I said, if you give this man a crack, you've given him a door. And so I texted 3 of my best friends. They all showed up, and we walked out with stacks of 10 boxes, walked right out and handed the food out to those that were homeless, right? Because here was my simple thought, right? If there's food that's going to go to waste, and there are people that need it, and I can be a conduit to get that food to those people, well, wouldn't I go? But why is it that so many of us make it more complicated than that? David Platt writes in his book, Radical This. I just want to challenge you for a moment. He says this. He says, every saved person this side of heaven owes the gospel to every lost person this side of hell. And I wonder if you and I have had some good news placed in our to-go box. And I wonder if we're taking our to-go box, if we're taking our food to places where people don't have access to this good news. Could you imagine your life without the good news of Jesus? There are too many places that don't have tables. There are too many places that do not have food. And there are too many places that have an overabundance of this good news that you and I have a responsibility to be a part of making a difference. And that's why we're passionate about missions at Nona. And I would say this, that if you're looking for a church, if you're on that journey, especially if you're in the curious chair and you're trying to figure out this whole church thing and what you believe and all that kind of stuff, red flag. If you ever visit a church that isn't passionate about what God's doing around the world and isn't talking about it, that's probably a sign that they care too much about what's going on their table than to realize it's not about the table, it's always about the food. Are you hearing me? It's not about the local church. It's about the food that the local church simply platforms for everyone else to receive. So your giving makes a difference in the world. Your serving makes a difference in the world. There's a couple of people here actually today who we get to celebrate that are a part of kind of this beautiful journey. They're incredible people. And they've been serving overseas for over 25 years. They were met with the impact of Jesus. They tasted the good news for themselves. They visited Romania, and while they were in Romania, they realized that ethnic Romanians were not letting the Roma people, the dark-skinned people of Romania, walk into their churches and be a part of their churches. So they just committed to say, hey, we're going to start tables and bring food to people and places where there are no tables and no food. They started that project 25 years ago, and they're with us today. Would you put your hands together as they come to the stage? Tony and Kelly Colico. What's up, man? It's good to see you, bro. Best Italian food in the world.
I am full of carbs.
Yes.
There is no doubt about that. And the best part of me is right there, my wife. And
Kelly, everybody.
She's so shy. She doesn't want to come up here.
All right. Well, Kelly, we love you.
But she really runs everything.
Yeah.
You all know that.
I believe it.
She's the boss.
I believe that.
Yeah.
Well, I've got 2 questions for you today.
Yes, sir.
The first question is, 25 years ago, you started this thing.
Yes.
You've got hundreds of stories of people's lives that have been changed. What's kind of one story where you've seen the good news, this food, impact a person's life and a person's story and the work that you guys have done?
So I got these questions 3 days ago, and Kelly and I were driving, we're talking, and I mean, there's really hundreds of people. And there's one young man, his name is Francis. And when we got to Romania 25 years ago this year.
That's incredible.
And 25 years ago this year, there was a 15-year-old boy. He was the slick dude with no shirt on, jeans, because that's the cool gypsy way. Mm-hmm. And he was looking in the window. We were in a 10 by 10 mud, really like a mud hut, but with a decent roof.
Yeah.
It wasn't Africa mud hut. It was Eastern Europe mud hut.
Yeah.
And this dude kept looking in, and he was curious, and we'd go back week after week, and I mean, we had to walk through the mud, and we really did what missionaries do. I don't feel like I'm a missionary, but we did what missionaries do. And he got saved, and we kind of brought him into our life, brought him into our home, and then I'm a mouthy, rude, I love Jesus, Italian New Yorker. And so 3 years go by, and Ferry's now 18 years old. I force him to go back to middle school. Literally, I paid a bribe to the school guy, the one-room schoolhouse, paid him a bribe, brought him some food and with some cash, no joke, and a Bible, of course. I'm a missionary. and forced him to go back to school. The education, him meeting his wife, he came to me, so 18, 19, 20. He comes to me when he's 20. We're at Camp Joy. We're up in the mountains. And he's like, I found my wife. And I said, dude, she's only 15 years old. He says, we're gypsies. We get married when we're early. I said, no, you got to wait. Waited till she was 18 years old. They got married. Ferry would come to me and he'd say, Brother Tony, I planted a church and I didn't ask you. Is that okay? And this was like month after month after month, and our ministry's growing and growing and growing. And Ferry went to Bible college, and they don't let the gypsies in Bible college, so we made our own Bible college, right? Even though they don't know how to read or write. Ferry made the huge impact. Now, the brothers want to travel and work in Europe. The gypsies are traveling and they're picking the fruit, they're digging the ditches. Now he's taken our guys, they're going to Germany, they're going to France, they're going to Belgium, and they're meeting with other gypsies from Romania. What do you think they're doing at the end of work? Sitting down, reading the Bible, and it's growing and spreading, and this is very true. This is what and why you guys give and send us. So that's one dude.
Yeah.
And there's many more dudes and gals and kids that are making that impact. And I'm nothing, guys. I'm you. I go to Orlando Baptist Church on 436 in Lake Underhill when I'm in the country. I'm a member of the church just like you. I sit right where you are. I'm just a normal dude with my wife, very carby. and that's it. We're missionaries. That's it.
Awesome.
That's it.
That's incredible.
Yeah,
that's
it.
incredible. So, please.
God, it's God.
Yeah. So, you could, right? You could simply do good work, education stuff.
Yeah.
You could, do some things that are important, solve some problems for some people. But you guys are committed to saying, hey, the good news of Jesus, like this bread that we're bringing, it's really important. Why is the gospel so important to you and so important to the work?
Yeah, so understand, giving a pair of shoes is important. Giving a cold drink of water is important. Giving a food bag is important. Giving Christmas gifts is important. Yeah. But I learned one thing, being Guido from New York and never hearing the gospel till I was 20-something years old.
Yeah.
The hope of the gospel is what makes the difference in everything. So when the gospel is first, when you give that drink of water, that person is more thankful and he or she will give a drink of water.
Yeah, that's good.
When you give a bag of food, they're more grateful for that bag of food and they'll give a bag of food.
Yeah.
And listen, we give food bags, we do all kinds of cool stuff. But really, truly, gospel first.
Yeah.
Because, what if in my crazy New York mafia days, before I met my wife's 65-year-old grandmother, before I got saved, what if I didn't get saved?
Yeah.
So hope, that's it.
Yeah.
That's what the gospel is.
That's powerful.
That's it.
Well, hey, we've got a couple of photos here that we want to show. I've been to this place. It's incredible. This is a church that the fellas have built there. I want to go to the second photo. It's really cool to see. If you look at this, they've kind of expanded what they do in this town called Nushfalu because there's so many people that are coming to church. It's incredible. I mean, I've been there and just seen the place packed out. And so they've been developing that and building that. And because of your giving, you've actually been a part of helping them expand that space. But kind of the next step, I don't know if you know this, but like Romania is kind of a cold place during the winter. So they're kind of building out, right? You guys are building out the interior.
Yeah, and the pictures look, it's winter, so the pictures, the sunny green that you see when you come for camp.
Yeah, it's not like that right now. Yeah, exactly.
No.
So they want to be able to host people kind of year-round and create a space that's really warm. And so we've heard that the next step, right, really is kind of putting in plumbing, putting in a heating system and all that kind of stuff. And we heard that that was going to cost about $10,000. So today, I just want to let you know, you got your $10K to be able to do what you need to do. We're grateful for you guys.
Okay, that's awesome. That's awesome.
So we want to pray for Tony and Kelly, and we're going to continue on kind of celebrating all that God's doing. Jesus, thanks for Tony and Kelly. Thanks for the work that they're doing. God, thank you that people that just give generously every single week here at Nona have no clue necessarily where every single dollar is going. God, the fact that dollars are going to work around the world to help people know Jesus, for us, God, to build tables and to place food where there are no tables and there is no food. God, we're grateful that we get to have that opportunity. Pray we're blessing over Tony and Kelly. Help them have an incredible kind of season of life and marriage and ministry with their kids. And God, we're thankful for the work that they're doing. We love you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
One more time for Tony.
Thank you.
And Kelly Kaliko, everybody. So here's how I want to close our time. You're going to be taking your passport in just a couple of moments to go and see this work kind of on the ground. But as I hold this box today, hold this takeaway box, I want to ask you this question. What are you doing with the good news? What are you doing with the good news you've been given? Where are you taking this box of grace, this box of hope, this box of the gospel to places that need to hear about it? Because here's what I know, all right? And this is why this is important as we start 2020 off. This is why it's so valuable as you think about how you are going to grow in your walk with God, okay? This idea of thinking globally is not an outside idea that you add into your faith. Thinking globally is a core part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And here's what I know. The more you enjoy the good news of Jesus in your life, and the more you share that grace with others, the more fulfilled you're going to be. Because here's what happens. Every time we serve, every time we go, every time we invest, doing what is close to Jesus' heart will always help your heart get close to Jesus. So if you find yourself in the child's chair, I want to challenge you to take a risk. And maybe your risk is this year. It's time to go on a short-term trip. It's time to go to Romania. Maybe you find yourself in the comfy chair. I want to challenge you to get involved. It would be easy for you today, for those of us that are comfy chair people, to not go and visit these different missionaries and say, hey, I gave my hour, I'm heading on with my day. But maybe God's got something for you in the next couple of minutes that you're not going to want to miss. If you find yourself in this chair, in the committed chair, I want to encourage you to think about who your one is. And maybe your one isn't a person. Maybe your one is a place. Maybe God's actually going to call you in 2020 to begin to think about how you could actually leave your job here. I know it sounds crazy. Leave your job here and go overseas there to build a table and to bring some food to some people that need it. The same way Tony and Kelly did that 25 years ago. Or maybe your one is a person who's sitting in this chair, the child's chair or the curious chair. That's the person you're thinking about. And they need your support to go. overseas. They need you to go with them on a short-term trip. Do not outsource those developmental opportunities to somebody else. Maybe that's what God has for you. And if you find yourself in the curious chair, if you find yourself saying, man, that Italian guy I just listened to was really loud and really passionate, and I don't understand what that all means when it comes to faith, here's what I want you to know, is that the longer you sit at this table, the more that you taste and see how good God is, the more passionate you'll become about the things that right now seem confusing and seem odd. So our invitation to you is to taste and see, sit at the table, wait a little bit longer, because maybe, just maybe, what God has for you is better than what you have for you. Maybe it is. But here's what I know, that the invitation to all of us in this room, to every single one of us, is to remember, no matter where you've been, what you've done, or what's been done to you, there's a seat for you at the table. Would you stand with me as we pray?